The year was 1423, and life in the shadowed villages of medieval Europe was a fragile thread, stretched taut over an abyss of suffering and uncertainty. To live beyond 30 was not the promise of a full life, but a cruel exception, a whisper of hope drowned by the relentless storm of disease, war, and famine. In the damp stone cottages nestled against forests black as spilled ink, children were born not to grow old but to survive. If fate was merciful, the harsh truth was carved into every wrinkle of the worn faces, painted in the hollow eyes of mothers who had lost more than they could bear. Here, the world was a crucible, where every breath was a battle against death's ever-reaching hand. Take Thomas, a boy of 12 with hair like autumn fire and eyes to knowing for his years, born into a poor farming family in a village that clung to the cold earth. Thomas was already marked by the weight of survival. His days began before dawn, hauling water from muddy wells, tending to the meager livestock, and helping his father break the stubborn soil. But the soil held secrets, darker than the tangled root secrets of sickness that crawled unseen through the damp air, poisoning bodies and spirits alike. Tuberculosis, scurvy, fevers that flared like wildfire. Each was a silent predator, hunting the weak and the weary. Thomas's mother, Eleanor, was no stranger to grief. She had buried 2 of her 5 children before their first birthdays, their small bodies claimed by maladies that left no mercy. Each loss carved deeper scars, turning her laughter to ash and her hands to trembling prayers. She dressed Thomas warmly each morning, her eyes flickering with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing the odds stacked cruelly against him. She whispered old prayers under her breath, invoking saints and angels, begging for a miracle she feared would never come. Disease was not the only specter haunting Thomas's world. The ceaseless wars that tore across kingdoms like ravenous beasts fed an endless cycle of death. News came in ragged whispers, neighbors conscripted and never returned, villages burned, and fields left fallow beneath the shadow of warlords' greed. Men marched away to battle, leaving behind widows and orphans swallowed by poverty and despair. Thomas's own father bore the scars of a distant skirmish, his body weakened and his spirit fractured. At night, the boy would listen to his father's haunted murmurs, the memories of blood-soaked fields and comrades lost. Famine stalked the land with equal cruelty. Years of poor harvests, blighted crops, and harsh winters left stomachs hollow and bodies wasting. Bread, once a simple staple, became a treasure hoarded jealously. Grains were mixed with chaff, and soups simmered thin with despair. Thomas and his family faced days when the hunger gnawed so fiercely it was a beast within their ribs. Mothers hid their pain to feed their children. Children fought over scraps, and the weak slipped quietly into the cold earth, swallowed by the dark without ceremony. The village church, a modest stone structure with stained glass windows dulled by soot and neglect, was the sole beacon of solace and fear. Father Gabriel, a man burdened by the weight of faith and failure, walked the narrow aisle with steps heavy as sin. His sermon spoke of divine punishment and redemption, of sin and salvation, but the villagers heard only the chill of death's approach in his voice. He administered last rites to the dying and buried the forgotten, his hands stained with earth and tears. Thomas sometimes watched from the shadows, wondering if even faith could save a soul condemned to such relentless torment. Amid this world carved from suffering, Thomas dreamed, not of escape, but of a future where survival was more than a daily miracle. He dreamed of laughter that didn't echo through empty rooms, of hands uncalloused by toil, of warmth that was not born of desperation. Yet each morning, the cold sun rose over the fields, and the grim realities settled again like frost. In this dark age, to live to 30 was to defy the very fabric of existence, and every day beyond that was a borrowed gift from a world ruled by cruelty. The merciless grip of illness tightened its claws deeper into Thomas's fragile world. It was the year of a particularly harsh winter when the sickness first crept into his family's cottage like a silent thief. His youngest sister, Alice, a mere babe wrapped in threadbare cloth, fell ill with a cough that rattled her tiny chest. Eleanor's heart shattered each time the feeble sound echoed through the cold room. She did all she could, boiling herbs, wrapping Alice in warmed blankets, whispering prayers to saints long forgotten, but the sickness, like a dark shadow, refused to lift. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was a specter that haunted every hearth. It fed not just on lungs, but on hope itself. It spread invisibly through crowded villages, carried by breath and whispered words. There were no cures, no potions strong enough to stop its slow, cruel dance. Thomas watched helplessly as Alice grew weaker, her breaths shallow and uneven, her bright eyes dulled by pain. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the wasting disease, a curse that no saint could ward off. But even as disease gnawed at the edges of life, the world beyond the village walls was no sanctuary. The 100 Years' War raged across the land like a festering wound. Armies marched through the countryside, leaving death and ruin in their wake. The distant sound of clashing swords and thunderous hooves was a constant reminder of the fragility of peace. Thomas's father, a once strong man, was called back to war, his body already weakened by years of toil and grief, his spirit burdened by the horrors he had witnessed. Letters came sporadically, their ink smudged by rain and tears. Thomas clutched each one as if it were a talisman, a fragile thread connecting him to a father slipping further from this world. The last letter bore words heavy with despair and exhaustion, hinting at wounds both seen and unseen. The next dawn, a somber rider arrived with news that shattered the family. Jean had fallen in battle, his body left among the slain, far from home and hope. Grief descended like a ravenous wolf, its howl echoing through the hollowed halls of their cottage. Eleanor's tears flowed freely, her once bright spirit dimmed to ash. Thomas, thrust into a role no child should bear, struggled to fill the void left by his father. Each day, he labored harder under the weight of survival, tending fields, repairing fences, and caring for his mother and sister. But the land was unforgiving, and the harvest thin. Famine tightened its grip with cruel efficiency. Crop failures from blighted seeds and relentless pests left granaries empty. Winter storms, brutal and unrelenting, shattered hopes of sustenance. The villagers grew gaunt and desperate, their faces hollowed by hunger and fear. Children wandered with hollow eyes, their laughter silenced by aching bellies. Thomas knew too well the gnawing emptiness that clawed at his ribs, the cold that seeped into bones no fire could warm. In the market square, once vibrant with barter and song, silence reigned. The few who dared venture out spoke in cautious whispers of bodies found in the woods, victims of starvation, disease, or worse. The church bells tolled for the dead more often than for the living. Father Gabriel's sermons grew darker, filled with warnings of divine wrath and impending doom. His voice cracked with exhaustion, the burden of shepherding a flock slipping toward despair. Amidst this crucible of suffering, Thomas found fleeting moments of fragile hope. In the rare warmth of spring sunlight, he would hold Alice close, willing her tiny heart to beat stronger. He dreamed of days when the land would heal, when laughter would fill the air again, and when the relentless shadow of death might finally recede. Yet the world he knew was a place where life was a fragile thread, easily severed by the sharp edges of fate. To live past 30 in such times was an act of defiance against an indifferent universe, a silent rebellion fought in every breath, every heartbeat. Thomas's story was but one thread in a vast tapestry woven from grief, resilience, and the unyielding will to survive. And as the seasons turned, the dark dance between life and death continued, a relentless march through the annals of a world forever haunted by its own fragility. As the years passed, the shadows deepened over Thomas's life, weaving a tapestry of despair from which there is little escape. The village, once a place of shared toil and quiet joys, had become a battlefield against hunger, disease, and the unrelenting grasp of death. Thomas's mother, Eleanor, now frail and worn, whispered to the wind as if pleading with unseen forces to spare what little remained of her family. Her eyes, once bright with hope, were now dim pools reflecting a world ravaged by suffering. Thomas himself bore scars unseen but no less real memories of his father's final letter, the hollow silence left by loss, and the cold nights spent beside Alice's sick. The once lively spark in his eyes flickered beneath the weight of responsibility and grief. Yet he pressed on, driven by a primal urge to protect the fragile flicker of life still burning within his sister. It was a desperate fight against the cruel design of the AGA battle no child should have been forced to wage. The specter of disease stalked relentlessly. Smallpox, measles, and the dreaded plague lurked in the shadows of crowded cottages and damp alleyways. The Black Death, which had ravaged Europe only decades before, had left a scar deeper than any sword, and fear lingered like a thick fog. When sickness struck Alice again, this time a fever that burned like a furnace within her. Eleanor's prayers grew more frantic, her hands trembling as she tried every herb, every charm. But medicine was little more than hope wrapped in superstition. One bitter winter's night, as the wind howled through broken windows and frost coated the earth, Alice's small body gave way. Her breath slowed and stopped, leaving a silence so vast it swallowed the world whole. Thomas held her close until the cold seeped into his bones, the loss unraveling what remained of his childhood. The village gathered, murmuring prayers and lowering the small body into the frozen ground. Each grave was a reminder of the fragile thread by which life hung. Grief, however, was only one face of the terror. The war beyond the village raged on, a distant but ever-present storm. Bands of soldiers marched through the countryside, leaving ruin in their wake. Thomas heard tales of villages burned, of fields trampled and food stolen. With every passing season, the world grew colder, harsher, and more unforgiving. As Thomas approached his 20th year, the weight of survival began to crush even his stubborn spirit. His hands, calloused and scarred, told stories of endless toil. His nights were restless, haunted by dreams of faces lost and futures stolen. He understood, perhaps better than most, that the cruel truth of his time was that very few escaped the harsh decree written into their fates. To live beyond 30 was an act of rebellion, a victory snatched from the jaws of an uncaring death. In the village square, under a sky swollen with storm clouds, Thomas's gaze met those of others hollow-eyed men and women who wore their losses like chains. They were survivors, each carrying invisible wounds. The old and the sick were the lucky ones, for death had claimed the strong and the young with merciless efficiency. Mothers buried their children. Fathers never returned from battle. The fragile thread of life frayed with every passing day. Yet, amidst the despair, Thomas clung to the sliver of hope that had sustained him all these years. He dreamed of a dawn beyond the dark nights, a world where survival was no longer a desperate gamble. But in the shadowed reality of the 1400s, such dreams were rare and flitting, a faint light flickering against the encroaching darkness. And so, Thomas lived, each breath a testament to resilience, each heartbeat a defiant echo against the relentless march of time. For in this age, to live was to fight, and to fight was to hope even when hope seemed all but lost. The final years of Thomas's journey unfolded, beneath a sky heavy with sorrow and bitter winds that whispered tales of despair. At 28, he was a man forged by hardship, his body etched with scars both visible and concealed, his spirit weathered but unbroken. The village around him had changed little. It remained a place suspended between life and death, where every sunrise was a fragile victory, and every sunset a solemn reminder of mortality's relentless call. The death of Alice, the loss of his father, the endless battles with hunger and plague they had all carved deep valleys of pain in Thomas's soul. Yet, in the depths of his suffering, a quiet resolve had taken root. He sought not only to survive, but to reclaim a shred of humanity stolen by the cruelty of his times. His hands, once tools of mere survival, now crafted hope-repairing broken fences, teaching younger children to read from tattered manuscripts, and sharing tales of better days with those too weary to dream. But the world would grant no reprieve. The plague, that merciless shadow, returned with a vengeance. It crept through the village like a silent assassin, sparing none who crossed its path. Thomas himself fell ill, his fever burning through the night, his breath shallow and ragged. In the flickering candlelight of his small home, Eleanor sat by his side, clutching his hand with trembling fingers, whispering prayers soaked in desperation and love. His final days were a tapestry of memories, the laughter of his lost siblings, the touch of his mother's worn hands, the faces of friends who had vanished like ghosts. Thomas understood, with a clarity born of facing death's door, that his life was but a brief flicker in the vast darkness of history. Yet even as his strength waned, his mind burned bright with a truth he wished could outlast him. That life, however fleeting, was precious beyond measure. When Thomas breathed his last, the village mourned, a soul worn raw by fate, but never broken. His passing marked the end of a story shared by countless other stories, lost to time but etched forever in the bones of the earth and the whispers of the wind. The world of the 1400s was merciless, a place where 30 years was a lifetime for many, and survival itself was an act of quiet heroism. In the cold silence that followed, as the village buried one more child of hardship, The legacy of Thomas and those like him remained. They were the shadows that shaped history's edges, the forgotten faces behind dusty tomes and crumbling stone. Their lives were brief candles flickering against an endless night, a haunting reminder that beneath the grandeur of empires and kings lay the raw, brutal truth of human fragility. So when you look back upon the 1400s, remember this: the reason few lived beyond 30 was not merely the cruelty of fate, but the fierce, relentless battle waged daily against forces that sought to snuff out the fragile flame of life. And in that battle, every breath taken was a triumph. Every moment lived a victory carved from the depths of despair. Because in a world ruled by darkness and death, to live even for a fleeting moment was to defy the very abyss itself.